Okay, here we go. Civil Rights and Black Power, 1945 to 1970. I uploaded the short version of the Civil Rights PowerPoint and the long version. I'm going to go through the short version today because we have a little bit shorter week. So I'm going to try to break this up into two 20-minute segments or so. Our objective is to trace the major events in the civil rights movement and evaluate its impact. Here are major concepts and key terms. I'm not going to go through all of those right now. We will go through those as we go. It's roughly kind of split in half there. All right, some cracks in Jim Crow's armor. We're going to talk about Jim Crow and where that name came from. And that's Jackie Robinson over there on the right. And he is going to be the first person to play, first African-American person to play in Major League Baseball outside of the Negro League. All right, the origin of Jim Crow comes from Thomas D. Rice's minstrel shows. The character was the happy slave known as Jim Crow, and usually was a derogatory term to use to try to keep African Americans in their place, so to speak. Some of the Jim Crow laws like segregation, the Plessy decision, a lot of disenfranchisement, things like poll taxes, literacy tests. These were all things meant to try to prohibit African Americans from voting. Things known as the grandfather clause, where whites could vote without having to pay a poll tax or take a literacy test as long as their grandfather had voted. And clearly African Americans didn't have grandfathers who could vote. So it was deliberately used to keep them from voting. Some of the executive actions used to start to end discrimination. Executive Order 8802, no racial discrimination by government contractors. There were some strikes and demonstrations. This mainly impacted the war industry because that's FDR there. I actually talked about that in our World War II PowerPoint. The Committee on Civil Rights in 1946 gave recommendations to then President Truman. His executive orders banned discrimination in the hiring of federal employees and integrated the armed forces. So the first major employer, so to speak, to become integrated is the armed forces. And here is a picture in the Korean War. You see African American men serving alongside of white men. All right, a new Democratic Party was formed, known as the Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond. It split the Democratic Party. They abandoned Truman in the 1948 election because he was pro-civil rights, and they really weren't. It looked like Dewey would defeat Truman. You can see that's actually Truman holding up the Chicago Daily Tribune picture there. And most people thought that was going to happen because the Democratic Party split. And because they split, they assumed Dewey would get just enough votes to get in. The reality of it is it was very close, but Truman did indeed win the election. Jackie Robinson, 1947, was signed by Branch Rickey. He breaks the color line in baseball. There was a Negro League and Major League Baseball. He is the first to play in Major League Baseball. Became Rookie of the Year in 1947, had .311 career batting average and 6 All-Star games. All right, school integration, the fight in court. Plessy v. Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896. It established the concept of separate but equal facilities. It's called the separate but equal decision, and it legalized segregation. The 14th Amendment granted equal protection. And there's kind of two things here that end up happening. De jure segregation is segregation by law, which was very common in the South. And then de facto segregation, which is segregation as a matter of fact. And that was more common in the South and in places in the North as well. It's usually achieved by intimidation, and we could certainly say that in some parts of the country it still continues today. All right, school segregation laws. The bright green there is where school segregation was forbidden. The blue is where it was optional, and the yellow where there was no legislation in regards to it at all, so it would be up to the individual school districts, and the red is where it was required, and so clearly required in southern states. Desegregation equals integration. Thurgood Marshall, he's the one in the middle there. Oliver Hill is the one on the left. They're both lawyers for the NAACP, which was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and something known as the LDF, or the Legal Defense and Education Fund. They are going to eventually lead the charge to end segregation. McLaurin v. Oklahoma in 1950. This is a court case. McLaurin, a retired professor, wanted to go to Oklahoma University School of Education. He was allowed in, but he had to sit in a side desk and was not allowed to mingle. He takes it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that conditions did impair his education. And here's a better picture of what his desk looked like off to the side there. Hemant Sweat was denied admission to the University of Texas Law School based on his color, sent to a separate black law school. He argued that the staff, the library, and the students were all different. The LDF, which was the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, targeted the Supreme Court's knowledge of quality legal training, and ultimately the Supreme Court will rule in Sweat's favor. Elementary and secondary schools. Davis versus Prince Edward County, Virginia, 1952, challenged segregation in Virginia. This is actually one of the 4 cases that become known as Brown v. Board of Education. Virginia NAACP lawyer Oliver Hill, who we saw in the previous picture, will be leading this case. And then we have the much more famous Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, Topeka, Kansas. Parents challenged the segregation school system. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled in favor and began to desegregate schools. One of the things that is talked about is something known as the doll test, in which African American children were given 2 dolls and asked to pick out which one was good, smart, and pretty, and overwhelmingly they picked out the white doll, which demonstrated the psychological impact that segregation was having on them. This is the Warren Court, their unanimous decision, and Brown v. Topeka is going to change the way segregation works in this country. All right, so Brown v. Board of Education. 14th Amendment, separate is not equal. It overturned a previous Supreme Court ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, ordered nationwide integration. It is seen as a huge landmark case in our nation's history. There is, as you might imagine, massive resistance to this. It moves at a very slow pace. Even though in the Brown decision they said it had to move at all deliberate speed. But significant integration does not begin until the mid to late 1960s. For those of you that have ever seen the movie Remember the Titans, it took place in 1971, and that was about school integration in Virginia. And so obviously quite a ways after that decision. Resistance to Brown in Virginia was led by Harry Byrd. He was a segregationist and a politician. And I think what's more interesting is some public schools in Virginia simply closed down from 1959 to 1964 rather than integrate black students at the time. See a resurrection of the Confederate flag. It stood for resistance to integration. All right, a couple different presidents will deal with various issues. The Little Rock Nine, who are pretty famous. We won't quite get into them much today. It takes place in Little Rock, Arkansas. Eisenhower literally has to order the 101st Airborne Division to walk them into school because the governor of Arkansas had blocked the school. James Meredith, he enrolls at Ole Miss. He too will require federal protection in order to actually get into school. George Wallace, who's Alabama's governor, he says states' right, very famous quote, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Believe it or not, he's actually a presidential candidate as well. Wallace making a stand as well in 1963, ceremonially, kind of stands in the way and will have to be moved to continue with desegregation. Kind of a consequence or side effect of this is something known as white flight. We see new private and religious schools start to appear, separate neighborhoods. We see a huge growth in the suburbs as a byproduct too of the 1950s and the consumerism and the amount of money that people have and the ability to move. And so we see neighborhoods that were probably fairly well integrated before. That doesn't happen. We see a lot of whites moving out to the suburbs, and the inner city becomes quite a bit more African American. All right, the People's Movement. This is a picture taken on the March on Washington, D.C. in 1963. A couple of the organizations we've already kind of talked about, the NAACP. We talk about CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, or SNCC, was Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then the SCLC was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. All right, the murder of Emmett Till, you watched this video on Monday and Tuesday. It's kind of the unofficial beginning of the massive civil rights movement in this country. There you can see Emmett's picture on the left and then what he looked like on the right when they buried him. Montgomery bus boycott, 1955, becomes the unofficial beginning of the civil rights movement. You see Rosa Parks being booked. They start economic pressure and basically almost puts the Montgomery Bus Company out of business. And of course, the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott will become Martin Luther King Jr., even though he actually turns it down the first time. They ask again, and he steps on board. Practices nonviolent resistance. Here we see some other famous people who have gone down that road as well. The sit-in movement in the 1960s, African Americans would sit at lunch counters where they were not supposed to sit, and they just refused to move. And you can see in the bottom picture there what the reaction is by others. Freedom rides in 1961 were an effort to kind of drive across the South and help people get registered to vote. Obviously, there was a lot of violence along the way. The picture here of a bus that was used in the Freedom Rides being burned. Birmingham, Alabama was considered to be the most racist place in America. You'll see police routinely using dogs on peaceful protesters. Firemen using hoses to spray the protesters. Very painful. And then we have the March on Washington, D.C. in 1963, led by Martin Luther King Jr. The I Have a Dream speech. which again, if you go back in and you click on this PowerPoint, you can see the text, video, and the audio. I have it all there, but obviously we don't have a whole lot of time right now, so you just have to kind of do that on your own. All right, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is what they were pushing for. At that time, though, Kennedy was president, but Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, and so it falls on Lyndon Johnson, who does push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in memory of JFK. So, same requirements for black and white voters, prohibits discrimination in public accommodations, withholding of federal funds from discriminatory programs and businesses, and bans discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and national origin by employers and unions, and creates the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Commission. Filibuster. Southern Democrats attempted to stall it by essentially talking the whole time and letting it expire. And Robert C. Byrd of West Virginia, who was a former Klansman, gave a 14-hour speech against the Civil Rights Act. And believe it or not, he was reelected to Congress all the way up until he died in 2010. He does kind of change his stance on civil rights much later, but still kind of a scary thought to think this guy was continually elected all the way up until 2010. The act becomes a law. You can see Martin Luther King Jr. standing behind Lyndon Johnson as he's signing it. Voting Rights Act of 1965. Federal officials may register voters when local offices block African Americans and eliminated literacy tests. So trying to break down barriers to be able to vote. The 24th Amendment in 1964 eliminated the poll tax. Don't have to pay to vote. All right, the Young Radicals. And I think this is where I'll stop, and then I'll pick up tomorrow.